So you felt that you were unable to do your job?
Yes.
Because
And when I made
interventions?
representations as a direct result of the correspondence, when I made representations regarding my position on the matter, I was told to have nothing more to do with it.
Okay. Thank you.
Who told you not to have anything more to do with it?
My line manager, Detective Superintendent Gray.
And how far up the Metropolitan Police chain do you think this went, that people knew that this was going to be opened up again after you reached a conclusion?
I'm pretty sure that it was at commander level.
The commander level?
Yes, that was at that time. That's who was chairing the strategic overview group, the goal group, into the matter.
Victoria Atkins.
Officer, in your statement that you provided to us, you refer to the fact that Jane was interviewed by a suitably trained and specialised officer.
That's correct.
Could you give us a bit of help with this? What do you mean by that?
We have officers that are specifically trained. It's called SOIT, Sexual Offences Investigative Techniques. They're officers that are particularly trained. It's a very, very intensive course to deal with victims of sexual abuse, to understand their specific needs rather than routine plod turning up.
Because obviously we're dealing potentially with very vulnerable people.
Absolutely.
Who have, they complain of experiencing terrible crimes committed
Absolutely.
against them. And that requires sensitivity. But it also requires you to do your job to make sure that you achieve best evidence.
Absolutely, and I am to a certain degree reliant upon my officers and their competency and their ability to do that. And my job is, once they've achieved that evidence, is then to review that evidence and make operational decisions based upon what they have obtained.
And what are the potential consequences if things go wrong at that stage with the complainant?
For the complainant, there could be many. Their confidence in the police, their confidence in the justice system would be rocked, if not shattered. It's in other cases they've taken action themselves because it's become too much for them. So it's one area where we really do go above and beyond in what we need to do to reassure that person and to achieve the best evidence, but most importantly, not at the victim's expense.
And looking forward, if a decision is made to charge and then it ends up in court, what potential consequences can any mishandling at an early stage in the investigation have on the success of a prosecution?
It can have absolutely massive consequences. Everything is disclosable within the law, and what we've done is held to account, and quite rightly so. So our conduct, our actions are all scrutinised, often with 20/20 hindsight many months later.
And summing up your role as a police officer, you've talked about you have a job to do, you have no agenda. A theme that police officers often follow is that we go where the evidence leads us.
It's a well-worn quote, but it's quite accurate.
And where did the evidence lead you in this case?
The evidence led me to the conclusion that on Jane's account alone, the actual points to prove for rape were not there. Therefore, despite the fact that Jane was insisting she'd been raped, in law she hadn't.
And we've heard mention of Mr. Watson's letter. It was a letter to the Director for Public Prosecutions, but it was later publicised on the 17th of May on a website called XRO. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
So that information was then in the public domain?
Yes.
Thank you. And again, this is in the background, this is in the context, as you've described, of Mr. Watson bringing many complaints to you as investigating officers, and also the media context.
Absolutely.
Campaigning.
And unfortunately, we say unfortunately we have a free press, but we have a free press, and Jane, sorry guys, Jane saw fit to speak to the media. The difficulty being, when she spoke to the media, her account varied slightly.
And it was precisely because Mr. Watson had brought these cases to your attention that you met with him and explained this particular case. Out of all the other cases, you explained it to him.
I explained this and the other strands that were live at the time.
Thank you.
How long did you head this unit?
From November 2012, when we first started the investigation, until May 2013.
And how many allegations? As opposed to convictions, you talked about convictions. How many allegations did you look at?
We had in the region of 400 bits of information from allegations at the beginning.
400?
Yeah.
And how many people have been successfully convicted?
We've got 3 convictions to date. Please appreciate that an awful lot of the information came from the internet and from was nothing more than rumour and anecdote.
And did you have to look into all those allegations?
We had to look into all of them to establish whether there's any truth to them.
Thank you. James Berry.
Yes, Mr. Settle, you described how you were keeping Mr. Watson abreast of a number of cases, in fact, a significant number of complainants, yes. Without getting into the details of any of these cases, were all of these people Mr. Watson's constituents?
I don't believe any of them were.
I don't believe any of them were. Were you keeping in touch with those individuals, members of Parliament?
The only other member of Parliament I had contact with, and please forgive me, the poor gentleman's died and I can't remember his name, it was their MP up in Manchester who made representations on behalf of one of his constituents.
Was it Jim Dobbin?
No, Paul.
Anyway, let's not speculate as to who it was.
But he was the only other member that I had contact with.
Are you aware of the convention in Parliament that we only act on behalf of our own constituents?
Absolutely not, I'm a policeman.
Right, okay. You'd expect the MP perhaps to tell you that?
Possibly, yeah.
Were you keeping any, you described Mr. Watson as a stakeholder, were you keeping any other stakeholders abreast of developments, charities, NSPCC, etc.?
We had, within the strategic overview meeting, the Gold Group, we had various other stakeholders there, such as the NSPCC, who've been of great assistance to us, and then other law enforcement agencies such as SOCA as it was then, the National Crime Agency as it is now.
Okay, so you've explained how in the meeting you set out the situation. Mr. Watson didn't really raise much of an objection then. Did he allege at that meeting that you failed to follow the guidelines?
Absolutely not.
No.
It was a very convivial meeting.
And so you didn't raise this with your senior officers? You went straight to the DPP with that complaint? Absolutely
no reason whatsoever to raise it with any of my colleagues or any of my senior officers. It was a very convivial meeting.
And your position is that you did follow the guidance? And actually, whereas you say that it wasn't proportionate to interview Lord Brittan, I think that what your evidence actually is that it didn't even reach the evidential threshold to interview him under the section of case that Mr. Burrows mentioned.
Absolutely, it fell at the first hurdle. There's what we set out to do was to strengthen the case as much as we possibly could, and in making those inquiries, it actually undermined the case. So it fell as soon as the evidential test was applied. It fell at the first hurdle.
So we didn't actually even get onto the issue of proportionality. It's more the evidence on your assessment.
Yes, my where I talk about proportionality, that's before I sent the advice up to the CPS, where I was saying I'm not taking any action now because I don't believe it's proportionate, because I'm going to speak to the CPS.
And finally, as I understand it, it's your view that in a case where a suspect hasn't been identified in public or hasn't been informed of an allegation against them, that when that information does come out into the public domain, by whatever means, the police ought to inform that individual that an allegation's been made against them?
I think once it's out there, we've got a duty to inform them exactly what's going on at the earliest opportunity.
Unless there are operational reasons not to. I struggle to find an operational reason not to. Very good, thank you.
Tim Lawton and finally Stuart MacDonald.
We've all agreed that MPs and others in public office have a role, indeed a duty, in handing on information where they think it's of use to the police and representing victims, particularly if they're their constituents. How many times did you meet Mr. Watson?
I would say 3 or 4.
And what sort of thing did you discuss with Mr. Watson?
Just basically, the first meeting I had with Mr. Watson, I put things into perspective, the first meeting I had with Mr. Watson was in the presence of a man who was making a series of allegations, and a journalist who was there who the guy wouldn't speak to us unless the journalist was present because he wanted it recorded, what he was saying. So that first meeting that we met with him, he gave us a series of allegations. We then had a subsequent meeting immediately after with Mr. Watson, where he said, oh, and by the way, we've got all of these, and handed over a load more allegations that were given to us. As a result of that, I met with him periodically. He came over to the office and saw the work of the team and what our other jobs were within the paedophile unit. Came over to see us, and I updated him periodically on the progress of those allegations he was aware of.
And when you say update him periodically, was he open to privileged information effectively?
No, because these people had come through him. So if anything, he possessed the privileged information before we did.
But presumably your investigations on the initial information that he gave you might have yielded further information, which was operational matters about the way you were handling it, what further witnesses it might have taken it to you that he wouldn't have been in receipt of.
Yeah,
Did you share that sort of information or not? So he didn't have any privileged information. Did he try to direct you as to how you might do your job differently?
No.
So you felt he wasn't being involved in operational matters at
I felt he was being very supportive, and we had a very strong relationship with him up until that letter arriving.
So on what grounds do you think he could have had for then sending a letter, and why would, if he had taken issue with you and then not come to you to complain that he disagreed with your decision, would you have expected him to have gone to perhaps your line manager or a senior officer?
Yeah, I just nobody was more surprised than me when the letter arrived.
So it was disproportionate perhaps to take it to the DPP rather than to take it further within the police themselves and then allow that complaint to become part of the public domain. What qualifications do you think Mr. Watson has got to judge the way police carry out their investigations?
None that I'm aware of.
And do you think that the way this case has panned out, the adverse publicity that it's had for the activities of the police, the relationship with Mr. Watson and others, do you think, you said that it had undermined your investigation and that it had the capacity to undermine parallel investigations going on, do you think this has had a more deep-seated influence on the way the police will continue to look at similar allegations in the future?
Yes, I do.
In what respect?
We're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're there to investigate things, and some of the people we're dealing with are very vulnerable and susceptible to exaggerating. We're there to sift through things, but we're also working within a climate where we have finite resources, and when those resources need to be directed towards something which is more life-threatening or immediate, unfortunately I can see a position being taken where things aren't necessarily looked at because of this.
And do you think that the way various details have been put into the public domain, not by the police, is going to have a detrimental impact on the ability or willingness of victims to come forward with further historical allegations in the future?
Absolutely, because we're in a position where this has been played out in the media, and where quite often victims' accounts have been played out in the media. If we're now not seen to follow through on what has become accepted as fact because it's been in the media, then we are all part of the problem, and we're all part of the conspiracy. The difficulty being that if the evidence isn't there from a purely objective evidential point of view, then we struggle to proceed with it.
So finally, you would agree that the way this case has panned out, the way that certain individuals have put it in the public domain, could be deeply damaging to the pursuit of historic child sexual exploitation cases, both for the ability and capability and willingness of the police to pursue them, and more importantly, for the effectiveness of victims coming forward and having their allegations properly looked at and taken seriously and pursued.
I think it has an impact, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Lord. Mr. McDonald, we're due to have a vote shortly, just to let you know.
As quick as I can. Mr. Settle, you described the liaison you had with the CPS, and you described the advice they gave you as helpful. Now, I don't think anyone here would challenge the fact that you came to a perfectly reasonable conclusion about how the case should stop. Having said that, the advice that you got from the CPS, it didn't actually say that you shouldn't arrest or you shouldn't interview Lord Brittan. It left that matter to you, is that correct?
The advice I was given said that the arrest or interview of Lord Brittan was an operational decision for the police.
Sure. And in your statement you've said that one of the reasons why you took advice from the CPS was because you are, quote, not an expert in sexual
That's
offences. Okay. Also in your statement you described the offence as, quote, not clear cut. Is that a fair description? Okay. So what I'm saying is, perfectly understand the conclusion that you came to, but in light of those comments, would you not say that another reasonable police officer might have taken a different approach and they might have decided to interview Lord Brittan?
I do not, if the full facts are looked at, because the pivotal issue becomes reasonable grounds to suspect an offence has been committed, and those reasonable grounds have ceased.
So you don't think any officer, if any officer came in and said to the committee that they, in the same circumstances, would have interviewed Lord Brittan, you would say that would have been unreasonable?
I would struggle to see how any officer that had read my 30 plus notes of decision log could rationally argue against the decision I made.
Okay. In a case which is not clear cut, what harm, what is it, what are the dangers of interviewing the accused person?
The issue for me at that time was one of anonymity and one of Lord Brittan's name being put out into the press and the associated issues that would come with. And as I've said, there were parallel investigations running at the same time.
Okay, I'll stop you there, but to clarify then, the prospect of media coverage was a factor in the decision?
First and foremost, the evidence was a factor in the decision. The prospect of adverse media coverage was a factor in not arresting him or interviewing him until we had clarified the position with the CPS.
And finally, you spoke about your dismay at the review that took place regarding the decision made, and you indicated that you thought the letter from Mr. Watson was related to that, but then you also said that your understanding was the review had been ordered 2 weeks before the letter. How does that?
I've heard that that's the case, but I wasn't at the meeting, so
Okay. Who did you hear that from?
I couldn't honestly tell you.
Okay. Was it somebody within the...
Somebody within the organisation, absolutely.
But how could a letter that hadn't yet been written cause a review to take place?
Good point, well presented.
Thank you.
DCI Settle, thank you for coming here to give evidence to us today. I'm still puzzled how you managed to get the CPS to give you advice, whereas Mr. Rodhouse, with his several letters, and senior management were unable to get the CPS to give them any advice whatsoever. But we will explore that with them. You've talked about a baseless witch hunt and a betrayal and the undermining of your investigation. But I go back to what I said to you before. 2 years later, after this had started and you'd come to a conclusion, the same conclusion was that there should not have been any charges. So even though you take no joy at this, you were in fact vindicated in your original judgment.
Yeah, I take no joy from it whatsoever, but yes.
And the distress that has been caused to the family of Lord Brittan must be immense.
I can only apologise and ask that, if in retrospect, if there's anything that I could have done which could have prevented that, I would quite happily have done it, because it's completely uncalled for.
Why did you stand aside as the head of this unit?
I was told to have nothing more to do with the investigation.
Any investigation or this one?
The whole Operation Fairbank.
Do you think that's because you had taken a stand, and you must not feel fettered in any way in talking to this committee? No one is going to do anything to you as a result of what you say. Otherwise, it would be a contempt of the House. Do you think it's because you stood your ground and said you really didn't think this should have been taken further?
Yes, sir.
That's a very serious reflection on those who made this decision.
Well,
So what are you doing at the moment, DCI Settle?
not a great deal.
I see. Well, we'll try and make sure you're put to good use, because I think that the Commissioner's made it very clear he needs as many officers as he can in the force. Thank you very much for giving us evidence today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Order. We expect to vote shortly, but we will call the Assistant Commissioner Patricia Gallen and Deputy Assistant Commissioner Steve Rodhouse. you were here, you had not been promoted. May I, on behalf of this committee, congratulate you on your promotion to your new senior position in the Metropolitan Police.
Thank you, Chair.
We had hoped to have the Commissioner here, but I gather that he is abroad.
That's correct. He's abroad in operational matters.
Yes, of course. And he's asked that you come, but we will see him at a later stage about the vexed question of police funding, which
That's
I know
correct.
is...
He's offered to come and see you about all matters.
Indeed. Now, can I at the start say, you sent out a letter to us last week and you issued a statement. And the committee has looked at some of the comments that have been made, and we're glad that it reflects the feelings of this committee in 3 respects. First of all, the Commissioner has requested that another police force should look at the investigation to make sure it's thorough and properly conducted and that it identifies good practice. We think that that's a good idea, but we hope that there is a timetable, because if we're going to get good practice, we need the good practice fed through as quickly as possible. Secondly, the Commissioner said that he believes that there is an imbalance in the current legislation, allowing suspects to be publicly named, both before charge, whilst those bringing allegations remain anonymous, and he feels this needs to be addressed. We believe that that's correct, and our predecessor committee, in our inquiry into police bail, which featured the case of Paul Gavaccini, accepted that. And thirdly, he's invited legislators to consider pre-charge publicity for suspects, whether additional legal safeguards are required. We agree that this is an important area, and we will be looking at that as well. So 3 easy wins with us today at the Select Committee. However, how would you describe the way in which the Metropolitan Police has handled the situation regarding the late Lord Brittan?
Might be helpful if Steve just outlines the actual process went through in the background, because I think that might help in a very short synopsis.
I think we'd prefer you to answer our questions, and then if you can supplement that later, that would be helpful. I'm asking for an overall view. I think we know the substance of it. How do you think it's been handled?
I think this has been a very difficult and unusual set of circumstances. The rationale behind actions that have been taken, I think, has been absolutely in good faith. The investigation was a search for the truth, is my summary of it, having reviewed all the papers. It was clearly a difficult set of circumstances, but...
You said that twice. That's
Indeed.
not what I asked you. I asked you, how do you think this has been handled? Not that it was difficult. Of course it was difficult, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here today.
No.
How do you think, as the goal commander, this has been handled when a letter of apology goes to the widow of someone who has not been charged with any offence on the day that the BBC decides to broadcast a programme? How do you think it's been handled?
I think these matters have been handled as well as could be in the circumstances, but I absolutely understand the distress caused to Lady Brittan. I absolutely recognise I apologised, and for good reason, because at the point that Lord Brittan died, I was in negotiations, discussions with the CPS to obtain a view of the evidence in this case, and I'm sure we'll come to that. But latterly, that was in January 2014.
So you would like to apologise to Lady Brittan?
Absolutely. I've apologised through her legal team. I would absolutely be happy to do that in person.
And what are you apologising for if you think that it was handled okay?
I do recognise that at the time the victim in this case, the complainant Jane in this case, was updated that there was no prospect of the CPS reviewing the case after Lord Brittan died, and that was in April 2014. I recognise that Lady Brittan and her legal team should have been updated at that time, and I regret that. That is a failing, and I apologise for that.
So that would have been after he had died?
That's right.
Yes. But the whole of 2013 appears to be, 2014 appears to be you writing to the CPS, asking them to back up your decision. You were playing a bit of ping pong with them.
No, I mean, these are complex circumstances, but the truth of the matter is that the investigation wasn't completed, and the full file of complete evidence arising from that complete inquiry wasn't submitted to the CPS until the 12th of November in 2014. And it was only on the 22nd of November in 2014 did I receive a note indicating the CPS weren't prepared to consider that file. And it was at that point that I appealed, and was in the course of appealing that decision because I felt this was absolutely a case where public confidence was best served for a full and independent review of the circumstances.
Actually, you didn't say that in your letter. You didn't mention public confidence. You said you thought that this was susceptible to media pressure and public cynicism. It wasn't public confidence. Actually, what the Metropolitan Police was doing was really protecting its back.
We don't mind difficult headlines in relation to this issue, but what I do mind.
So why did you say it was media pressure and public cynicism that got you to take so long to make this decision?
What concerns me was the impact that this case would have on people considering coming forward to report serious allegations such as rape. So difficult headlines for the Metropolitan Police, so be it. But what I didn't want is for people to be put off because they had fears that allegations against prominent people wouldn't properly be considered.
But Mr. Rollins, you didn't say that in your letter, though, did you? What you said in your letter was that you'd be susceptible to media pressure and a great deal of public cynicism, and therefore you wanted the CPS to make a decision that you couldn't make, which DCI Settle was able to make in the previous year. This was just kept on and on and on while the late Lord Brittan was very ill and dying, so he died without being told what you and everyone else in the Metropolitan Police and the CPS already knew.
Well, as we've heard, the investigation was reopened in April 2014, following we've heard from DCI Settle for the reasons why. But thereafter...
What were the reasons in your view? Was it because of Mr. Watson's letter?
No, I don't believe it was.
So what do you think it was for? Why was it reopened then?
My understanding is that a colleague of mine who was the Gold Commander at that time...
Who's that?
Commander Graham McNulty, received a briefing in relation to this case. He wasn't satisfied that all aspects of the investigation had been fully conducted, so he therefore commissioned a review. That's a very common practice, a peer review by an experienced investigator, and it was that review that highlighted that there were aspects of the investigation that hadn't been fully completed. And so that was the reason it was carried out.
But on completion of the investigation, you came to exactly the same conclusion that DCI Settle had come to in February when he informed the complainant and also informed Mr. Watson. So what I can't understand, what puzzles me, is why did all that take a year and a half? And in the meantime, the late Lord Brittan had died with this hanging over his head. I mean, that's really what we're concerned with today.
Absolutely. And I understand that concern. But when the investigation was reopened in late April 2014, the decision was taken following the review. That review completed on the 19th of May. Lord Brittan was not arrested, but he was interviewed under caution later that month. Thereafter, other investigations took place. There were some delays. The majority of those delays were caused by Lord Brittan's ill health. But it wasn't until the 12th of November that we were in a position to say the investigation from our perspective is complete and submit that to the CPS. And as I say, the rationale behind that, clearly there was consideration as to whether the full code test had been met. That being, was there sufficient evidence to warrant a charge in the matter, in our opinion?
But the CPS kept saying it's nothing to do with them, didn't they? They said, you're the police officers, you'll need to make the decision.
Well, they said in response to the file that DCI Settle submitted that it was an operational matter as to whether or not the police conducted an interview. I have views on DCI Settle's decision at that point. But thereafter, the CPS, in our communications with them, highlighted that there were other aspects of the investigation to be completed. So that was what we did. So the CPS have never reviewed the full file of evidence in this case. The judgment that my officers had to make, and I support...
And you wish they had?
I wish that they had reviewed the file of evidence.
Would you want them to do it now?
I don't know that any purpose will be served now, but that was certainly my intention. Because I think if we take ourselves back to the context of the day, and Mr. Winnick highlighted that well in terms of Lord Brittan's name was in the press for a number of reasons. There was public speculation over his role in the handling of the Dickens dossier. I myself at this time had to refer a number of cases to the IPCC where people are coming forward to highlight concern over the role of police in investigating prominent people. Lord Brittan had been named in the media. So this was a different context, and for reasons of public confidence, because I want people to come forward and report these serious offences in the confidence that the police will tackle them without fear or favour, no matter who is named in the allegation.
But you keep referring in your letter to media pressure and public cynicism rather than the confidence of the public. But let me finally put this to you. Is this not about the politics of fear? When you have prominent people and the public believe, or the press believe, or the cynicism of the public that you refer to, believe that you haven't done a thorough enough job, that people will think that you're letting them off. And therefore, the more famous you are, the more the police will actually want to investigate you.
I think this investigation was following the evidence where it could and conducting a thorough investigation of all the circumstances. That wasn't done within DCI Settle's investigation. I understand his rationale, but there were other inquiries that needed to be conducted before we could say we'd done the job thoroughly.
Okay. We'll stop there and come back after the vote. Thank you. Order, adjourn the committee. Proceedings, the committee is quorate. My apologies, Mr. Rodhouse and Ms. Gallen, for keeping you waiting. Such is life in the House, I'm afraid. Mr. Rodhouse is putting to you a couple of final points about the politics of fear. This is about the police when there is a celebrity or a very famous person. You feel you're under an obligation to check and recheck and to submit files to the CPS and to order new investigations, because you're fearful, in your own words, of media criticism and public cynicism. How would you answer that?
No, I think it's important that we do a thorough investigation on every occasion. But clearly, where the subject material of that investigation is subject to public scrutiny, it's particularly important that we've got it right. It's important that we can reassure the public that if they come forward to report a serious offence, we'll investigate it thoroughly, no matter who the allegation is against. So I don't regard it as politics of fear at all.
And you feel you've now got to the right conclusion on this?
I think so.
Because quite a lot of officers must have looked at this file by now.
Yes, a number have.
There's Mr. Price, there's Mr. Settle. Presumably you've looked at the file before coming to give evidence today. Maybe Patricia Gallen has, maybe the Commissioner has. You're all very satisfied that no further action needed to have been taken.
Well, when the file was submitted in November 2014, it was my judgment then and remains that the full code test wasn't quite met.
No, I'm talking about now. I understand that, you've said that before, but now you're satisfied.
I've seen no evidence to change my view.
Right. So it's exactly the same position as DCI Settle had when he decided to discontinue.
No, I disagree, because now we've completed a full and thorough investigation, and Lord Brittan was interviewed. He was able to give his account of what happened, and that's really important. Really important. Undertaking an interview, it was highly unusual to undertake an investigation of this nature without interviewing the person who's accused. Lots of reasons for that, and if I may, I could outline some of those, but not least, it's important that Lord Brittan is able to give his account so we can follow that through. In this case, the CPS advice was that the incident as reported, the jury could have been persuaded that it may have taken place. They did raise significant concerns over whether Lord Brittan would have known that Jane wasn't consenting to sex. However, when we spoke to Lord Brittan, he didn't raise that as an issue. His account was this incident never took place at all.
Unfortunately, you can't tell us what he said because he's not here to count anything that you said.
Well, I can recount the evidence.
Well, we don't need a rehearsal of the evidence. We're talking about process here and the way in which you've handled it. So you're saying, as far as you're concerned, nothing has been done wrong, but you felt you should apologise to Lady Brittan, to conduct a review and to call for changes in the law, but nothing has gone wrong.
Now, as I've said in my letter to Lady Brittan's solicitors, clearly I do regret not informing her at the same time that we informed
But that is
Jane.
the only thing you think you've done wrong?
Absolutely. This has been a search for the truth.
So why would you want to have a
public.
review then? Another review by another police force to look at good practice if you, as a senior officer of the Met, feels that nothing has gone wrong?
I think it's always good practice to have another pair of eyes, experienced eyes, looking at our investigation to see what lessons we can learn.
And does
for the
that
future.
happen to all the cases that you do? You think it should be reviewed?
Not every case, but where we do think there's value in it, absolutely we will do that. It's a well-established process.
Assistant Commissioner Gallen, who took the decision to remove DCI Settle from his post?
Well, I think we've got to be clear that neither DAC, Rodhouse or I were in post at the time, so we've had to go from documentation at that time, but it seems to be his line managers decided at the time of the review that it was appropriate that the line manager took over that position.
Right. Thank you. Did you know about it? Did senior members of the Metropolitan Police know that he's been removed from his post?
Would you mean now or then?
Well then, I think we all know now.
Okay, well I just wanted to be absolutely clear because I think it's important that we know about what aspect we're talking about.
Well then,
at the time, the commander was aware that a detective superintendent was taking over the investigation.
now there has been a lot of changes announced in the last week. You've disbanded some inquiries, you've put others together. Does that come under your supervision?
They all come under my business group, yes.
Why did you take all these decisions to disband certain inquiries or amalgamate others and change the head of the organisation, that is the unit that is now looking at these cases?
Well, I think it's not in terms of stopping investigations.
No,
it's putting
I didn't say that.
well, just to be clear, it's where there are links between them, there are crossovers in terms of intelligence and in terms of some witnesses and some allegations. So it's better to have it all under the one detective superintendent. We talked about it in the summer that it was time to do that, and this was an opportune moment to do it, when at the same time we were increasing the resources we're having within the Rape Command as a result of the Dame Ellis review, and as well as that we're preparing for the public inquiry into child abuse. So we know that we've got to prepare for all of those things, and it's as well having our resources in the one place.
Yes, and the success rate of 400 different pieces of allegations and only 3 convictions, that doesn't seem like a very good success rate to me.
Well, I mean, we can go into it in a lot more detail, but I think the challenge with rape allegations is they are particularly difficult to get to court. They're also, when they're historical in nature, are very difficult to prove. And I think that shows the challenges of historical investigations. It also shows some of the challenges with this particular investigation. When something has taken place a long time ago and there are probably only very few witnesses, it is going to be a challenge, but it's our job to investigate it and find out what facts we can.
Thank you. Mr. Jardine.
Thank you, Chairman. As the Chairman said, I'm simply looking at the process here. But first, could I just ascertain from you, I hope the answer is yes, but every British citizen is equal before the law, aren't they?
Yes.
So, taking that a step further, and I'll come back to that point in a moment, DCI Settle is a senior, experienced officer, would you not agree?
Yes.
So when he sought advice from the CPS as part of his investigation, part of the due process, and did so anonymously, we would expect, everyone being equal before the law, that advice was then fair, balanced and appropriate.
Yes.
So why is it then that following a due process being followed and the CPS writing back to the Metropolitan Police on 22nd November saying it didn't meet the appropriate criteria, did the Metropolitan Police believe that it should be appealed due to the strong public interest, which has a strange correlation to a letter that was sent from Tom Watson on the 28th of April 2014?
That was my decision. And as I say, the reason behind that decision was because I thought this was a close-cut case. It was important that the public had reassurance that we'd fully examined all the material. And my reason for the appeal wasn't because that I felt the CPS had made a wrong decision in examining the evidence, it's because I wanted the CPS to consider the evidence so that the public could be reassured that there had been a full and thorough examination of all the facts. Now the investigation had been completed. Very particularly, and the truth in this is bearing in mind the context of the day in terms of what else was going on.
But it seems to a layman such as myself that you are applying a different test to this investigation. You are possibly being led into certain decisions by parliamentarians, the media and others. You, by your own admission, have said you've taken a decision because you wanted to avoid media criticism. And surely that is not due process. Surely that is not equality before the law.
Now, I wanted the same standards to apply to everyone, but absolutely it was right in a case of such public prominence, of such interest, to check that we'd got our decision-making right, and that was what I was seeking.
Isn't that what you should be doing, though? I mean, you're the senior officer. You should be able to review a case and decide whether it was right, the right process that your officers followed. The CPS has already made its decision clear.
Well, ordinarily, yes, but I think there are a very small number of cases where the public interest is well served by having the evidence reviewed, and that's what I was seeking here.
So, because of the particular individual, you are applying a different test, and a warning therefore should be to all of us around this table and in the chamber across the road that if someone makes an allegation about us, we face a different test in your eyes.
Now, I think that the point, as I said, is the same test needs to be applied. This was about making sure that that test had been correctly applied.
And you don't trust the Detective Chief Inspector to arrive at an appropriate decision?
On this occasion, I've heard DCI Settle's evidence. I'm sure he came to his decision in good faith, but I don't agree with the decision. And the case is there are a number of ways in which you could pursue an investigation. My view was that he should have conducted an interview. But that's not to say his decision was irrational or wrong, but it is to say that other officers reviewing it, and as they have done subsequently, could and did lead to a different conclusion. And in that case, I think it would have been the right thing to do to interview Lord Brittan at that point.
But you accept now that the process that Metropolitan Police followed was flawed, caused huge pain to the family, and that is something that you regret.
Well, clearly this investigation has caused pain to the family, but my point is that at the point at which Lord Brittan died, I was still in discussions with the CPS seeking them to review the evidence, and therefore it wasn't possible to tell Lord Brittan or indeed his legal advisors that there was not to be a prosecution.
Thank you, David Burrows.
Yes, just in your view, obviously you've were trained, what's the Bible in relation to interviews, as it were, PACE and Code C, 10A, you'll be so familiar with that. So you're disputing the investigating officer's view that there weren't reasonable objective grounds for the suspicion based on known facts and information to enable an interview to take place.
Well, clearly I have a view on that, and I'm happy to talk about that, but probably more importantly, the reviewing officers and their supervisors at the time did. My own view on this is that there were reasonable grounds to suspect an offence had taken place on the basis of what the victim has said. Issues of consent are, as people would judge, in people's mind, and it was entirely appropriate, and there was absolutely, in my view, a legal power to conduct that interview. That was an interview conducted not under arrest, under caution.
Under caution. This is the code's under caution.
Yeah.
So there need to be those reasonable objective grounds. So in your full file review, did those include 30 pages of that decision log, which we heard from Officer Settle?
I don't believe that the reviewing officer saw the decision log at that time. The reviewing officer conducted her review on the basis of other documentation. That's not unusual. We have a process within the Metropolitan Police in many cases where a detective chief inspector, decides to take no further action following an allegation of rape and an investigation. We'd run a process called a rape scrutiny panel where we will dip sample and review those investigations. It won't necessarily be done with the decision log in hand because it's a review of the facts at that time.
But when was the first time you looked at that log?
When I looked at that log, that would be some weeks ago.
Some weeks ago?
Yes.
So that was after you came to the conclusion of wanting to review and then appeal the decision?
Well, the review was
but that is
tasked.
but
the review was tasked in April 2014. I subsequently came into this in July 2014, but it was my decision to appeal to the CPS in November 2014, yes.
Wouldn't it have been helpful to have looked at the original officer's decision log of some 30 pages to be able to give some flavour or reasoning behind the original decision not to pursue an interview?
It may have been, but my judgment, I think, would have remained the same. This was a case where the facts were not clear-cut, as per DCI Settle's evidence, and it was right that an experienced rape prosecutor, in my view, took a view because this was one of a small number of cases where the public interest was better served.
And that public interest, I mean, your view, as we mentioned before, that's you've written in your report concerning the reaction and the concern about media criticism and public cynicism. And plainly that has no relevance to the codes of practice. It's not referred to. Public cynicism, media criticism or anything like that isn't referred to in the codes. So that has no relevance to a decision whether to interview.
No, absolutely not. The two issues are separate. My view, for what it's worth, is that there was a legal power to interview Lord Brittan and there was no breach of the PACE codes. But latterly, my decision around November was a separate issue.
And on the reaction we heard from the officer so there was blind panic as a result of the intervention of Mr. Watson and made reference to communications involving a number of officers. What's your response to that?
Well, I wasn't in role at the time, but I have spoken to many who were, and absolutely none of them recall blind panic. The letter from Mr. Watson to the DPP was written on the 28th of April. The briefing that gave rise to this review took place a week earlier. The letter was never sent to the Metropolitan Police until the 2nd of June, so we weren't aware of its existence until late May. So the decision to take the review, and indeed the decision to adopt the findings of the review, were taken in isolation from that letter from the DPP. I don't believe there was any influence.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows. Victoria Atkins and then Stuart MacDonald. We need to make progress, please.
On what grounds did the Metropolitan Police search Lady Brittan's homes on the 4th and 5th of March 2015?
I think you're alluding to publicity to do with another operation. That is a live operation where we've never named anyone responsible.
Which we don't wish to know about.
Sorry?
Which we don't wish to know about.
Okay, thank you.
So that was not in relation to Jane, is what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Right. We've heard from DCI Settle about obtaining early investigative advice when he had conduct of the case, and he sent an anonymised report to the CPS, and they duly sent an opinion back saying no further action is required, the evidential test isn't met. Did you anonymise your request to the CPS when you made it?
If I may just address one point, the advice from the CPS didn't say take no further action. It said it was an operational matter for the police, and it was indeed coded saying further action required. We weren't seeking a charging decision, that was early investigative advice. In relation to the file submission in November, that wasn't anonymised.
Forgive me, pause, please. On that, DCI Settle's evidence was that following the advice received from the CPS and in conjunction with further advice received from the CPS, because he made 2 applications, he applied the test and found the evidential test was not met.
It was a police decision based on that evidence. It wasn't a CPS decision. I've seen the advice and it clearly says that it's an operational matter for the police.
But officer, help me, in complex cases, not just in sexual offences, but in the wider arena of organised crime and terrorism and frauds, it is perfectly normal, indeed it is recommended, that the police or the investigating body seeks advice from counsel on charge. Yes?
Yes.
Why did that not happen in this case then? Why was advice not provided?
At which point, sorry?
As you were making the decision to charge, you say that you sought advice from the CPS.
We weren't making a decision to charge.
I think we need to be very clear. The advice that DCI Settle sought was early investigative advice, a precursor to seeking any decision to charge. We weren't at that stage.
What advice were you seeking in the later stages?
I was asking for the CPS to consider the file. My acknowledgement was that it hadn't quite met the full co-test, but as I've said, this was a case where I thought that it would be valuable for the public interest for the CPS to review that evidence nevertheless, to give the public confidence this has been a robust investigation and that when prominent people are the subject of allegations, it will be dealt with properly. In the context of an awful lot of stories and indeed referrals that I'd made in relation to my own force to the IPCC, where people had come forward to say that they had evidence that officers hadn't acted correctly in the past.
So in other words, you wanted the CPS to back your decision, to cover your back?
We wanted to check our decision making, whether we'd made a good decision.
Thank you. Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Berry.
Very briefly, Mr. Rodhouse, you said that DCI Settle's inquiry hadn't been completed entirely. We've also heard about your view on whether or not Lord Brittan should be interviewed. Was there anything else that you think DCI Settle should have done which hadn't happened?
Well, I think the interview was clearly the key part because once Lord Brittan had said that he didn't recall the incident, it didn't take place, clearly we needed to address the issue of identification and whether or not Jane had correctly identified Lord Brittan as a person who she believed had raped her. So there was a process to establish that, clearly very challenging with the passage of time and a known individual. There were also inquiries to establish whether Jane's description of the location of the offence or the incident was consistent with where Lord Brittan had been living, and she also described some aspects of Lord Brittan's possessions, and we were seeking to establish whether that was borne out as well.
And none of that had happened under DCI Settle's investigation?
They were all done, that's right, they were all done subsequently.
Okay, and very briefly, DCI Settle's applied the following test when making his decision about whether or not to interview Lord Brittan. He refers to the Code for Crown Prosecutors, paragraph 4.4, which clearly states a case which does not pass the evidential stage must not proceed no matter how serious or sensitive it may be. Is that the right test he should be applying when considering whether or not to interview Lord Brittan?
No, in my view, it's not.
What is the appropriate test then?
When it comes to interviewing, it's a judgment call as to whether or not there are grounds to do so, and whether or not it would add value in any way, shape or form. So the issue here is that Lord Brittan could well have given a cast iron alibi to suggest he was out of the country at the time of this allegation, in which case my officers are left with trying to establish whether this is a malicious allegation, and we've taken action in respect of those fairly recently too, or whether or not Jane was mistaken in her identity. So there are issues that arise from an interview that I don't think were adequately covered by DCI Settle's rationale.
How many cases? Sorry, Mr. Burrows. Mr. Burrows. Order, Mr. Burrows. How many? Just on point of clarification, how much action have you taken in respect of malicious allegations?
I don't have statistics for you, but I'm aware of a case within the last 2 or 3 months where that exactly was the case, where an allegation was made against a prominent individual. We believed it to be malicious and false, and therefore action was taken. Thank
you. Sorry, Mr. Burrows, please.
You formed a judgment on the substance and extent of what DCI Styles' investigation was in terms of the stage that it got to and the decisions not to interview, without actually looking at the log. I'm not sure how you can properly come to that judgment.
The log is not the only place where his decision-making was documented, so there are...
It's a key document.
It is a key document, but I'm satisfied with the judgments that have been made on the information.
And you said in response to Stuart Madonna that a decision about whether to interview, you also said, or whether there's any added value. Now, I don't see reference to or any other added value in the guidance to code of practice. I mean, that opens up anyone when an allegation, a serious allegation or minor allegation is made. If you can get an added value out of it, you're up for interview. Now, that doesn't seem to be the lawful, does it?
Added value is potentially clumsy wording, but to prove or disprove the offence, I think, might be better.
James Berry, finally.
Are you saying that the guidance on what you can refer to the CPS should effectively be amended so that you can refer cases to the CPS when you can't make up your mind whether the evidential threshold's been met? And secondly, where the evidential threshold has in fact not been met, but you think there's a wider public interest in having a second opinion?
Yes, we are. I've written to the DPP and discussed it with her. The reason for that is about transparency. It's not about us trying to cover our backs or justify at all. It's rather there are a number of matters which are of public interest, where in the past people haven't had confidence that police will do a full investigation, and we know that by the number of referrals to the Independent Police Complaints Commission alleging corruption in the past by police officers. And as a result of that, there are a very small number of cases which are either involving things like police corruption, high-profile individuals, or in terms of being very complex, where the evidential test hasn't been met. So in other words, we as a police service aren't trying to push it up and say, we think there's a case here, because that would be entirely wrong. Rather, we're saying, we've searched for all the evidence we can get, we don't think there's any more. We would respect and seek the advice of an independent prosecutor in whichever area of criminality to review that case for us. They may come back and say, you've made entirely the right decision. Or as happens in some occasions, very helpfully, they say, you haven't followed all the lines of inquiry. Have you thought about X? And I think it's really important for public confidence. It's really important for people out there at large to know that we will take their allegations seriously and that we'll follow them through. And also that we are not judge and jury, that we will always seek other people to review our decisions as well, where appropriate.
Do you see the risk that in cases of public interest, and most cases involving high-profile individuals could well be described as falling into that category, you could be seen as passing the buck?
Well, I think that could be seen in that way if we were saying they've met the evidential test. We're not saying that. We're being quite open and honest. And in fact, in the case of Lord Brittan, I was quite clear in my part, as if the CPS weren't willing to make the decision, we, the police, would make the decision and be quite clear why we've made it. So I think we need to be very direct about that. It isn't a case of passing the buck. It's about us being transparent and open, where we haven't always been in the past, and about saying what the facts of cases are. But in terms of prominent people, it comes to the very fact of what the Commissioner has spoken about why Parliament, and it is for all of you, to consider whether additional safeguards need to be put in. It's important that I emphasise at no point until last week did the police service put the name of Lord Brittan into the public domain.
Oh, no one's disputing that.
So, but I think it's really important because I think it's one of the issues that needs to be got across. There are a number of safeguards that we need to consider.
Mr. Lawton, as a final very quick question. We have to move on.
Firstly, you, Mr. Rodhouse, have described this as a close-cut case. DCI Settle described it as the evidential basis fell at the first hurdle. How can there be such a disparity between colleague police officers open to the same amount of facts and information on a case like this?
I can't account for DCI Settle's decision making. I think that clearly, if you take the DCI Settle's view as fact, and I don't, then clearly there would be a long way between us in terms of law. But if you take an alternative view that it was entirely open to him to conduct an interview, the natural course would have been to conduct the inquiries that I outlined earlier, and actually we wouldn't have been too far apart. This is, I've not put the details of the allegation into the public domain for obvious reasons,
Yes.
and I don't propose to do so, but my judgment is that it isn't clear-cut.
But you can see why it is worrying. If it depends which police officer you go to, you may get a completely different decision. But can I just, very finally, just probe you on the public interest better served point, which Deputy Commissioner just made as well. Is it the case, therefore, on what constitutes public interest, that if Lord Brittan had been another, that you would have taken the decision not to reopen the investigation?
I don't believe that to be the case. We commonly receive letters from MPs, campaigners, around individual allegations, particularly where the victim in that case, the complainant, doesn't believe there to be a thorough investigation. We listen to them all, we address them, and absolutely we would undertake a review. In fact, that's now been enshrined in process. Since April this year, sorry if I may finish, since April this year, there has been a victim's right to review where no further action has been taken in respect of rape allegations. And what that means is, if the victim in the case is unhappy with the police investigation, it will be reviewed by a different officer.
So you don't think that the decision would have been any different to reopen the case if Lord Brittan had been an ordinary member of the public?
Absolutely.
Thank you. One final point about the Gambaccini case. Is Operation U-Tree under you, Patricia?
Yes, it is.
It is. And I'm sure you've had the opportunity of reading the committee's report on police bail.
Yes.
We've just received a letter from the DPP, which we will raise with her, so I'm raising it with you, as to the length of time it took to inform Mr. Gambaccini that there was no action being taken against him. And she's informed us that the police wrote to her in February 2014 with the initial papers, but it took a further 7 months to get the entire file from the police to the CPS. So I'm just a little puzzled. On the one hand, you keep wanting the CPS to give you advice, and on a case like Paul Gambaccini's, which is in the public domain, which we have discussed, and indeed he's written a book about it, it took you 7 months to actually send the file. Why was that?
Well, I haven't got all the details and I'll need to have a look at the DPP's letter, but I surmise that we've asked for early investigative advice, and then at some stage we'll have put in the full file, which isn't unusual. That cases we will work hand in hand with the CPS. We will very often put evidence in along the way, and at the final stage we will submit the full file. I'll happily look into the case for you and write back a response when I know all of the details.
But it's a very... the DPP's going to give evidence in a minute. Well, not in a minute, shortly. It's a long wait, isn't it? 7 months. It just mirrors what's happened in this case. This all could have been done so much quicker. The late Lord Brittan could have been informed if the processes of the Metropolitan Police could have been quicker. No one's to blame individually for this. It's a system that allows delay to actually prevent what the Home Secretary talked about, which is timely information.
I understand that, and we all want timely investigations. I think I'll need to look into all of the circumstances. However, what I would say is that investigations very often are complex. It involves meeting victims in all areas of the country. We've got to, in occasions, evidence that takes some time to retrieve back in terms of its telecoms and such like. So cases aren't always straightforward. I'm talking about the generality rather than the specifics of the Mr. Gambaccini's case. The specifics of that I will look into because I know the broad details
Thank you
of it
very much.
and happily write back to you.
Let us have an answer by Friday. I'd be very grateful.
Unfortunately, that might be a little challenging because I won't be here. So if you could give me a little bit more time, that would be helpful.
Are you also abroad on operational matters?
I'm not on operational matters, but I won't be here. So if I can have a little bit more time, I will personally ensure you get an answer.
Okay. That's very kind.
Thank you.
Very much, Assistant Commissioner, Deputy Assistant Commissioner. Most grateful. Order, could we call Tom Watson to the dais, please? begin by congratulating on your election as the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, most warmly, and to declare an interest on behalf of both Mr Winnick and myself, which is in the public domain, that both of us nominated you for that position. So you know it's all out there.
Mr Vice, just before we begin, can I say I have an ear infection, so my hearing is slightly impaired today. So
right.
If you could speak up.
We will try to speak up, but we're not shouting at you, just understand that.
Well, that might come later.
Look, these are very serious matters, obviously, and we've had some very compelling evidence from both the senior ranks of the Metropolitan Police as well as Detective Chief Inspector Settle. And he's used the phrases baseless witch hunt and betrayal in respect of some of the activities and actions that you've been involved in. He's also, on the other hand, said that you played a very important part in ensuring that individuals were brought to justice. And he talked about the 3 people who have been convicted, who may not have been convicted, had they not come to you and had you not passed things on. I want to limit this to a discussion of process on the allegation by the witness Jane in respect of the late Lord Brittan. And I want to start with one of your quotes, which you may know of. You said that he is as close to evil as any human being could get. That sounded to me and others as being a bit emotional, because you've addressed this whole issue of child abuse very seriously. But this is actually emotion, isn't it? Do you regret using the words about someone, presumably who you've never met, that they are as close to evil as any human being could be?
I do regret using that phrase. Let me just give you clarification on that. That was not a phrase that I used. It was an alleged victim that used that phrase, but that wasn't Jane.
No.
But I do regret using that emotive language. I shouldn't have done, and I am sincerely sorry for repeating it. It was unnecessary.
Because, of course, to the family of Lord Brittan, and indeed, I'm not sure whether this was used when he was alive originally, to him it's not very nice to hear those words.
It wasn't used when he was alive. But yes, I am sincerely sorry for the hurt caused to Lady Brittan for repeating that phrase. I felt at the time that some people's voices were not being heard, but I used the wrong language, and I'm very sorry about that.
Now, we've heard evidence that you were something of a hub in respect of these allegations. People would write to you. You'd made this a big issue after your involvement in the phone hacking issue. You had turned to this issue, people had written to you, you'd raised it in the House of Commons. Do you think, as a Member of Parliament, you actually went a little too far in trying to run the process rather than be the conduit which would enable people to send you information and then you would then pass it on to the police?
No, I wasn't trying to run the process, but nor was I anticipating the volume of information, allegations, alleged survivors and alleged witnesses that would make themselves known to me or my team. I initially asked a question on a very narrow point, and then there was an explosion of information that came into the office that most MPs would think it's their duty to pass it over to the police to investigate.
Because you've used this word a lot, a duty to pass on. I think we all have those situations where we as members of Parliament have a duty to pass on. Yeah. But you seem to have gone beyond that, to the extent where the investigating officer, having told the complainant, Jane, on the 4th of February, then met you and gave you an explanation as to why things were being closed down. That's over and above, is it not, your duty as a Member of Parliament?
When I met DCI Settle on the 10th of February, I wasn't aware of the agenda. I wasn't aware what he was going to share with me when I met him. Indeed, my recollection of the meeting is slightly different to his. He did raise this case, but I didn't understand that was the purpose of the meeting. At this point, I saw DCI Settle's tested me on the monitors, I think I should say that I had a very good working relationship with him. And it is my view that he is a very good police officer, and he led a very good team of investigators who were dedicated to their cause. And I was not aware of the allegations he'd made in front of the committee until he made them.
Of course. But looking at what he has said, and looking at the meeting of the 10th of February, he was very clear that there was no case to answer. You, at that meeting, whether you were surprised at the contents of the meeting or not, didn't raise any issues against that. You subsequently, however, then wrote into the DPP in words that he described to undermine the investigation that he had taken place, that both you and him had been working on for so long.
Well, that wasn't my intention, and I had no cause to write the letter. When he told me that that was his judgment, I accepted his judgment. It was only when I met Jane for the second time. I first met her in December 2012, and the second time I met her was in late March 2013, where she described the meeting she'd had with DCI Settle, which he himself said was not a pleasant meeting. She felt very distressed and raised a number of concerns about the decision he'd taken.
And you backed her up?
Well, what I did at the time, she was very distressed when she talked to me, was ask her to go away and reflect on what she told me and give it right to me about how she felt and what why she felt there was an issue.
Is that really your job? I mean, we've had stories in the newspapers of your office being used as a place for suspects to be interviewed. Is that really your job, Mr. Watson? I mean, you're not Sherlock Holmes, are you?
Well, it's certainly not what I was looking for. I mean, I was asked, I had a meeting with DCI Settle's team in mid to late December 2012. They asked me to come into their office. And one of the things they asked me to do, this was presumably after the Savile affair, was reassure the public that if they came forward, they would be treated seriously by the criminal justice system. They would be believed and their case would be looked at seriously. And that's what happened with Jane. She approached me in December 2012 and made a very brief allegation. I then asked her if she'd reported it to the police. She said she'd reported it to her own police authority, which we now know as South Yorkshire. I reassured her that I think the police would take her views seriously. Fast forward to March 2014, she felt very let down. She'd had to give 2 3-hour interviews with the same testimony.
Yes.
The first to South Yorkshire, the second to the Metropolitan.
So you still believed her story?
Well, it wasn't for me to believe her or not, to judge her, but I did feel, having reassured her that she would be treated seriously, that I at least owed it to her to test whether the system, the criminal justice system, was doing its job.
And that is why you wrote to the DPP?
That's why I wrote to the DPP.
And the DPP's role in this was very simple, to pass the letter immediately on to the police. And you were then informed that the interview had taken place before the letter had arrived. Is that right?
No, I had no knowledge of any interview of Lord Brittan until I had a phone call from the Independent on Sunday, the day before my letter was revealed in that paper.
And as far as you're concerned, that you worked with the police over a long period of time, that the special relationship that you had was designed to bring these cases forward, and that you don't believe that you have overstepped the mark in trying to run some of these investigations and undermine the investigation, or you don't feel you betrayed DCI Settle, which he believes that you have done.
I feel very sad that DCI Settle feels that, because I had a very good working relationship with him. Neither of us really wanted to be in the position where there was such a volume of information that needed to be passed over to the police. And that wasn't my intention to affect his career. I just wanted to make sure that Jane, at the point that I'd spoken to Jane, I wanted to make sure that her voice was amplified in the system.
And you don't believe that because of your letter there was panic in in the Metropolitan Police that Tom Watson had written in, and if we didn't do what Tom Watson said, it was going to be all over the media?
Well, I'm slightly bewildered by what I've just witnessed on the monitors and in the room. There's obviously a disagreement at the Metropolitan Police on whose judgment was right. I wasn't aware of any of that at the time. I sent a letter to the DPP. She wrote back to me in June to say she felt that from their point of view, procedures had been followed, and she'd passed the letter on back to the Metropolitan Police, and that was the last I heard of it.
Would you like to take this opportunity to apologise to Lady Brittan for some of the comments that you have made? Because I don't know whether you have, but others, of course, have talked about the illness of Lord Brittan, the late Lord Brittan. It must be terrible for the family. What would you like to say to Lady Brittan as a result of what has happened?
Well, I'm very sorry for the distress caused, and I'm very sorry for a wider family. I know they're very angry, and they clearly loved Leon Brittan very much, and they're angry on behalf of their family member, and I am sorry.
But they appear to be angry with you. Do you think you have some responsibility for their distress?
Well, I feel that the people's voices were not being heard, and I felt responsibility for them, and I hope they can try and understand that.
Mr. Burrows.
The Brittan family solicitors have followed up in that issue of apology. They say they found particularly hurtful the impact on their family. Your remarks not long ago, on the 12th of October, on the floor of the House, where you said that there was far more than meets the eye to this case. This was extremely distressing. They also referred to the comments made by you so soon after Lord Brittan's death on Twitter and elsewhere. Do you apologise for those comments?
No, the comments I said on there related to a question I was asked about DCI Settle and the conduct of the case. And it was my view that the accounts that had been reported in the newspapers that I'd effectively forced the Metropolitan Police to change their view on the case was not correct. And so I was saying in an interview where I was put under pressure that I felt that there was more to that particular issue.
Yes, and so are you suggesting, in terms of, if, for example, the late Lord Brittan was here before you today, what would you say to him?
Well, he's not before us today, and I'm sorry about that. But I can't. I mean, you are asking me to comment on things beyond the Jane investigation, and I don't think it would be helpful or appropriate.
In terms of the Jane investigation.
Well, the Jane investigation,
for this committee.
I've only, like you, I'm seeing the Jane investigation unfold before the committee. I was not aware of much of this internal debate and disagreement at the Metropolitan Police.
But DCI Settle said, he says, I apologise in retrospect. If anything I could have done to change it, it was not called for.
But I'm not responsible for the operation of the investigation. I can't be. I don't know about it. What I did was amplify the voice of Jane.
And did you have...
Order. Lord Prescott, I'm sorry, we're in the middle of a session. We do not want chatting in the gallery. Mr. Watson.
Yes.
Sorry, Dan.
In terms of there's your letter that you sent on the 28th of April, did you have any other further contact with the Met Police or CPS in relation to the matters pertaining to that letter?
No, I had the letter back from the CPS, and my recollection is that was the last I'd heard of it.
And this particular letter, you don't just make representations, you're quite specific. You refer to the guidance, the actions of the police officer being contrary to ACPO, CPS guidance. You make specific requests for an interview and arrest. What authority do you have to make those particular requests?
I don't. Those were, though I did have cause to read a thing called the ACPO CPS protocol.
Yeah, I've got it all here.
Which Jane had read, and her belief was that in cases like this, in judging participation, consent or an alibi, the police must interview the alleged suspect. And I thought she made a very compelling argument. And so I looked at the document. It's since been updated, but there there was a section within it that gave me cause to think, if I wrote to the DPP, it may be that the procedures were not followed. I don't know. It seems to be that that's what senior management at the Metropolitan Police feel, but that's not for me to judge. I was trying to amplify Jane's voice in the system.
I mean, you made reference to it, that you specifically wanted Lord Brittan to be interviewed. You gave your particular opinion on that rather than just simply giving a voice to someone else.
I was trying to make sure, having read the guidelines and having talked to Jane, I wanted to make sure that they were not treating Lord Brittan differently to any other person. And okay, I might have been forceful in my language in the letter, but my intent was to make sure that the system was working properly.
And you went to the DPP rather than to the boss of the officer in the case. Why was that?
Yes. Well, I just felt the DPP, I may have been wrong to do that, but I felt the DPP would know, would give proper guidance on how to conduct the inquiry.
Thank you, Mr.
And just finally, the officer referred to a baseless witch hunt, inferring I suppose your part, because you were involved in wanting the investigations to be continued.
I missed his point on that, but I certainly did not want to take part in baseless witch hunts.
So he said in the decision log, he referred to if the matter went further by way of interview, that it would amount to a baseless witch hunt, which no doubt he's holding you at least partially responsible for.
But I wasn't aware of that he'd written that in his log until an hour ago.
Either.
And nor was I aware of the judgment that he took and his managers took. I was.
But that's the accusations been made, not least indeed by the original officer in the case. How do you respond to that?
I don't know quite what he meant by that judgment. I mean, I'm not sure if he was saying that he chose not to interview Leon Brittan.
But what's your view on that?
Because he was worried about
how do you
media.
view that judgment that's made, not just by him, that this has been a baseless witch hunt?
Well, I don't know. I'm not party to all the information in this case.
In relation to this allegation, can you give a judgment whether there's the accusation, as far as you're concerned, that you have conducted a baseless witch hunt?
With respect, Mr. Burrows, this is I've only heard what's been said today, and I've not seen the evidence that the police have collected. I don't know what judgment they've made, so it's hard for me to make a judgment about whether DCI settles view that this might form a baseless witch hunt is accurate.
Thank you, David Winnick.
Would you describe yourself, Mr. Watson, as a campaigning Member of Parliament?
I guess all MPs are campaigners, Mr. Winnick, yes.
And the background, before you took up the matters of allegations of sexual abuse and the rest, was on hacking, wasn't it? And you wrote a book about it.
I did.
So when you started campaigning and informing the police of various allegations, you had already, to use an expression, established yourself in the public eye as a campaigning MP, and you wrote a book. What was it called?
Dial-M for Murdoch.
Which some would say was responsible for the closure of the News of the World, apart from anything else. Now, I want to bring you, Mr. Watson, to the climate in which you took up the allegations, in particular Jane. Am I not right? It was a climate where there was a great deal of public concern, parliamentary concern as well, understandably, that historical sexual abuse cases, going back in some instances 40 years and more, Savile, Smith, etc., had not been dealt with in any way whatsoever. These characters, having committed these foul crimes, had died, and there was a sense of injustice that this was continuing. Would that be a right way of describing it?
I think in the media there was that, and in the country people were angry about that. Yes.
And when you say people were angry, what made you in particular decide, after the hacking issue, to more or less take up the same role as a campaigning MP on what I've just said?
Well, I wasn't really looking, believe it or not, to make this a big campaign. It was the sheer volume of information that came through my office that detained a lot more time than I thought. I was actually trying to have a quieter life after the hacking inquiry. But just to give you an idea of the scale, within 6 weeks, since I asked my first question, we had 299 separate contacts. Some of that information, some of those allegations, some of those people claiming to be witnesses or victims. And so it was very difficult to keep up with it. We had to, we had to list it all and send it through to the police. And then they marked up which pieces of information.
Could we confine it to the Lord Brittan issue? Thank you.
Thank you. The 3 cases which led to a successful prosecution came from you. Is it because, and I think this is very relevant, Chair, is it because the people concerned that led to the victims involved contacted you?
No, on the first point of contact was when an individual who'd been a specialist on a previous Metropolitan Police inquiry had approached me to say that he was concerned that a previous inquiry had been closed down prematurely, and that he believed there was intelligence that could lead to further convictions. And that led to the opening of an investigation that led to the conviction of Charles Napier for 13 years. And
thank you. We need to...
Therefore, it would be difficult, would it not, to describe you as some kind of fantasist who out of the blue makes allegations or takes up allegations where there is no foundation at all.
No, I hope that's not the case. I hope people don't say that.
As shown in these 3 cases, though not in the case of Lord Brittan. Reference has been made publicly to another Member of Parliament who didn't identify Lord Brittan, but on social media, Lord Brittan's name was mentioned. Does it surprise you that only you have been called to give evidence and not Lord Goldsmith?
Well, sorry.
Not Lord Goldsmith.
Order. I don't. Order, Mr. Winnick. I don't think that we can ask the witness why he was called. This is a decision that was taken by the committee. James Berry.
I asked if he was surprised that he was the witness called and no other member.
Very few things surprise me in Westminster these days, Mr. Winnick. But I'm sure that Zach Goldsmith could give a good account of himself if he were.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. James Berry.
Mr. Watson, just to be clear, there's no criticism of you whatsoever, certainly from me, for referring on allegations of serious and disgraceful sex abuse to the police in confidence. But you published an article, or had an article published in the Daily Mirror on the 24th of January 2015, didn't you? That's right, isn't it?
Yes, I've apologised for that.
Well, you've apologised for one comment in it, but just to be clear, at the point when you published that article, Lord Brittan had not been named by the police, had he?
He had.
Well, I think...
Oh, not by the police, no sorry. His name was in the public domain.
He'd not been named by the police, and indeed the police had not provided any details of the allegation, had they?
No.
No. Did you ask the police for their views before publishing that article in the Daily Mirror?
No, I didn't.
Did you ask Judge Goddard's inquiry team for her views before publishing that information in the Daily Mirror?
No.
It is important, isn't it, that the Goddard inquiry is able to carry out its investigations fairly without witnesses' evidence being contaminated in any way, isn't it?
Well, I sincerely hope the article will not influence the Goddard inquiry, because there are plenty of things with this case that I think that I do need to say to the Goddard inquiry, but I hope that article will not prejudice that.
Well, in publishing that article in the Mirror, you were not promoting the interests of the Goddard inquiry, were you?
Well, nor was I undermining the Goddard inquiry, in my own view.
Well, in publishing those allegations in the Mirror, you were not promoting the interests of the victims if they want a full and fair inquiry before Goddard, were you?
Well, one of the reason I wrote the article, and I've retracted the phrases I used, was there were. It's hard for me to go down this road and stick to Jane.
And I think you should stick to Jane.
It's hard for me to answer that question
Mr. Berry, we must confine our questions to the witness Jane. Rather than any wider.
Perhaps that could be helpful. When I wrote the article, it bore no relation, nor was there any attributed quotes to Jane.
No, but we're also dealing with the effect on Lord Brittan and his family. And just to put a final question here, you say that you wrote the things that you wrote, for which some of which you've now apologised for, because you felt the victims' voices had not been heard. But in fact, the victims' voices were being heard because you'd reported their allegations to the police, hadn't they?
Well, they felt very strongly, or at least one of them did, that they had had justice denied. But that is not related to the Jane case, and I'm in a very difficult position when it comes to...
Isn't the fact that the only interests you were in fact promoting there were your own political interests in publishing that article?
No, James, that's not the case at all.
Next, now the ex-head of the elite flying squad, John O'Connor, has said this: the mere fact that he's made it into a political issue and all these people he was making allegations against just happen to be in the opposition party, I find appalling. I can't see any justification for what he's done. Now, they're not my words, they're the ex-head of the flying squads. Now, you are aware that there are disgusting allegations against politicians from what were the three main political parties, yes?
Well, in relation to the wider allegations that aren't Jane, I can assure you that I have reported allegations that link to politicians in all the three main political parties.
But would you accept that by, in public, only pursuing Conservative politicians, you are at least open to the allegation that you're motivated more by politics than by a pursuit of justice? That's
not factually correct, though. I've publicly commented on the conduct of the inquiry in Rotherham. I've commented on, in the early days, although there is now a potential trial on the Jana issue, and there are other public comments I have made. So I don't accept the facts as you put them.
Oh, if that's wrong, I'll check it. And just finally, you've received allegations from a former Labour councillor called Chris Fay, haven't you?
Does it relate to Lord Brittan, the late Lord Brittan?
It has no relation to the Jane case at all.
So I think we probably better not put that before you. Dealing with this tribal issue, that you are tribal, and that your campaign on News International was separate from any criticism of the Mirror, who were also involved in hacking, and other organisations that were involved in hacking. You can categorically say to this committee that whatever you get on an all-party basis, you put to the police.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you. Mr. Watson, you said that you became an unwitting hub for people who were victims of child abuse or alleged victims of child abuse contacting you, and you wanted a quieter life, you mentioned, which then contradicts. Why do you have a page on your website inviting people to come forward if they have been victims of abuse?
That was related to the early days of the inquiry when, in December 2012, the police themselves asked me to reassure the public and believed that because some of the cases...
So can I just take... So the police needed your help to reassure the public that they can do their job for child abuse victims?
Yes, the police were concerned that in light of Savile and in light of allegations where previous police inquiries had not gone to plan, that public reassurance would help, and that's why that's why I did what I did.
So as well as being an MP for your constituents, you are now conduit for police, reassuring the public that they can do their job.
Well, as I've explained, I didn't want to find myself in that position, but right. When you do, you really only have one choice.
Great. I have your website page here, and I've also got the website page for NAPAC, the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, and also the NSPCC's websites, especially the pages where they ask people to contact them, whether it's by telephone or whether it's online, if they feel that they've been victims of abuse. So when you set up your page, were you following any best practice out there in the field that's interpreted by all the major charities that deal with child abuse victims?
Actually, what we did, very early on, it became very clear for my staff that they needed some kind of support and advice on how to deal with very vulnerable potential witnesses and victims. And so we met the national NSPCC very early on and tried to signpost people to the NSPCC. And we
How
also
do you do that? Because there's no signpost on our website.
And we also took advice from the Metropolitan Police, and I think a detective sergeant came and advised my staff on how they should collect the information and then how best to deal with it afterwards.
There's no link from your website to NAPAC or NSPCC, whereas the other two charitable organisations quite easily signpost people to call or other places for them to go, but yours just seems to go to you. So what do you do with the data?
The
Where do you keep
well, it yields very little information actually. I'm afraid I've not looked at that page for a long time. But the idea was that when people came forward, we could get them into the system, into support.
System?
Either into the criminal justice system if they were making a specific allegation, and reassure them that they would be taken seriously. And as DCI Settle said, in one particular case, that ensured that a successful prosecution happened.
Thank you, Mr. Yes. If it relates to the Lord Brittan.
In a little way, in a way, it's about duty of care. My concern is about duty of care. If one person goes to your website, out of going forward to the NSPCC or the other website where they've got processes in place, where they've got response times to email people back, these are vulnerable people that need care and attention. If they're contacting you instead of them, are you failing your duty of care?
One of the things we try to do is people who need help is to get them help as quickly as they can, and the NSPCC became very important in that, both the hotline and the counselling service. But actually, you're taking me beyond this.
We would prefer you not to.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms.
Just got two very quick questions.
It's concerning the Lord Brittan.
Yes. You mentioned that when you spoke to Jane, that you gave her reassurances that she would be taken seriously.
Yes.
So, what expertise or training do you have to assure victims of abuse that their evidence will be taken seriously?
Well, I had to make a judgment on the competency of the Metropolitan Police team, and actually I judged that they were very serious and very well trained and competent. In the case of Jane, though, she'd made the allegation, I now know, I didn't know at the time, before I'd asked any questions in Parliament. In light of the Savile case, she said that she'd come forward because Alison Levitt had said we can never ignore victims again in light of Savile, and she felt that she should talk to a local police force on that basis. It was then that the alleged crime was supposed to have taken place in London, and the Metropolitan Police took over.
Thank you very much, Stuart MacDonald, and then Victoria Atkins. We do have the DPP next.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. We've heard some evidence that you had a pretty decent working relationship with DCI Settle for a period. Did you have a similar working relationship, just for clarity's sake, with Commander Graham McNulty?
I don't think I've ever met Commander Graham McNulty, although I might have done. I have no recollection of him.
And you didn't have any working relationship with him in the early part of 2014? No, I don't think I did. Okay.
I could check my files to see whether there was any correspondence, but I'm pretty certain there wasn't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. MacDonald. Victoria Atkins.
Mr. Watson, let's be clear. Everyone here wants to secure justice for the victims of sexual abuse. All right? So in that vein, if someone jeopardised, potentially, the trial of a sex offender, how would you feel?
Well, like everyone else in this room, I would worry that was happening.
Now, you've described it as being a surprise that you had an explosion of complainants contacting you after your statement in PMQs in October 2012. On at least 13 occasions since then, 12 occasions since then, you have referred to, amongst other things, Lord Brittan, you've referred to paedophile networks, you've referred to paedophile ministers and cabinet ministers. Of the 299 allegations you received, how did you choose which ones to publicise?
I didn't publicise, I don't think I publicised any of them. What I did was list them and send them over to the police, who then came back to me on 52 of them and said, can you contact these people? We would like to follow this up. And so my main task in the early days was to talk to those people to try and convince them that they should talk to the police directly.
Well, we've seen blogs and so on where you have in fact published, I would put, the allegations of these complainants. But I'll deal with Jane. How did XRO website get your private letter to the Director of Public Prosecutions such that they were able to publicise it in May 2014?
They got it from Jane.
From Jane?
Yeah.
All right. And you, in terms of your other allegations, how did you decide which ones should go on your blog and which should not?
In what sense? In what sense?
Well, in your if I can help you, your statement following Lord Brittan's death, you referred to Jane, you referred to other complainants as well. How did you choose them out of the 299 allegations you received just in that 5-week or 6-week period?
In order to answer this question fully, you would draw me away from the Jane allegation.
Well, if you can confine it to the Jane allegation and answer Victoria Atkin's question, why did you choose that one?
The blog post I wrote did not relate to the Jane issue.
It didn't.
So those were other complainants that you chose, just so I'm clear?
There are other complainants.
And with Jane, why in this particular instance did you choose Jane?
In which instance is this?
Well, you're talking about 299 allegations in the first 6 weeks following your 13 comments that you've made since then. Why? How did you choose which paedophiles, which ministers, etc. to pick?
I didn't choose Jane. Jane chose me.
But you haven't publicised all of the victims that came to you, have you? You can't have done because there are so many of them.
Well, that wouldn't. No.
No. All right.
Thank you.
Just, if I may just follow this through, please. With your experience of campaigning in the world of sexual abuse, you must know that the police do not publicise allegations from complainants before trial. Yes?
Yes.
And did you stop and think for one moment that repeating these allegations in the public arena in the course of an investigation may contaminate or prejudice a future trial?
The allegations against Lord Brittan were not repeated until it was impossible for him to stand trial.
How many times did you meet Jane?
Twice.
And when you comforted Jane and reassured her, did you video that meeting?
No.
No. Did you record the audio of it?
No.
So if in a future trial defence counsel accused you of potentially coaching this very vulnerable complainant, you would have no way of proving otherwise, would you?
Well, the logical conclusion of what you're saying is that I shouldn't have met Jane, or I should have videoed my meeting with Jane.
No, the logical conclusion, Mr. Watson, is that you are a member of Parliament, not a police officer. And as we heard from DCI Settle, police officers who deal with these cases are very highly specialised in their training precisely to achieve best evidence. That's the phrase that is used in the criminal justice system.
Well, all I can say is that I was trying to do my very best on Jane's behalf and trying to help DCI Settle in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you.
And just one final question, please. It follows, given your answer to my first question, that if any impact, if there has been any impact on future investigations or prosecutions, as DCI Settle referred to, then you yourself must be very worried about the way you have handled some elements of this campaign.
You can only do your best. And as an MP, you can only try and get people into the system and refer their allegations and information to the police, and then it's down for the police to do their job.
So will you learn lessons from this then?
Well, I will be looking very closely at what the conclusions of this committee report are, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Well, we have not decided we're going to have a report, Mr. Watson. In your Huffington Post blog, you state that I did not and could not know if they were true, but I did believe their claims should be fully investigated.
That's right, Mr. Bass. Yes.
Is that also a reference to the Jane meetings? You didn't know what she was saying was true, but you felt they should be fully investigated?
Yes.
So you were not a witness on behalf of Jane. You were someone who was saying, here is someone making a complaint, it needs to be investigated.
That's absolutely right, yes.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Watson, I think it's fair to say you and I have sort of been at the forefront of the campaign to get child sexual exploitation raised, have its profile raised, that we have encouraged victims to come forward, and we've encouraged the police to take allegations seriously, which have not been taken as seriously as they should have been in the past. And I think we'll all agree that that is a job of a member of Parliament, and it's absolutely right that we should pursue that. What I'm puzzled about is where individual MPs then take it on individual cases and appear to interfere with the due justice process thereafter. So specifically, in your statement when a point of order was raised on the 12th of October, and in specific reference to the Jane case, you said it's not for me to judge the validity of these claims, as the Chairman has just alluded to. But in your letter to the DPP on the 28th of April, that is exactly what you are doing, because you are questioning whether the police have actually pursued these claims, and you are strongly suggesting that the claims have greater validity than the police have decided at that stage that they had. So you were trying to play prosecutor and effectively jury there, were you not?
I certainly wasn't, Tim. What I was trying to do was challenge
Mr. Lawton would be.
Sorry?
Mr.
Lawton. Sorry, Mr. Bass. Sorry. I was trying to challenge the system to make sure that they were adhering to all procedures.
But you see the point I'm getting at. Nobody is criticising what you've done, what I've done, I hope, in raising this whole situation. But you said you had a very good relationship with DCI Settle.
I did.
And you met him on a number of occasions. You successfully brought information which led to people being prosecuted, which is a good result that we would all applaud. So where did it all go horribly wrong, such that DCI Settle told you quite categorically that in his professional view, as the lead officer on the case, that it didn't even meet the first hurdle of evidential basis to pursue, and now tells us he feels undermined and that you have betrayed him? Where did it go wrong?
Well, I feel it came to the point where the meeting I had with him, actually my recollection was this was a very tiny part of it, and my concern at that meeting was he'd had a family tragedy, and I was concerned for him. I thought no more of his judgment on that until I met Jane at the end of March, when she was very distressed. And in that situation, I could have tried to mediate, or I could have tried to amplify her voice in the system. And I felt that she felt so strongly about it, and then went away and wrote to me that that was the right course of action. I didn't realise that DCI Settle would see it as a betrayal. I understood he would not like it, but I certainly didn't do it with the intention of undermining him.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I'm very
Lawton.
concerned to see what he said today.
Okay, now I understand that, but if you were concerned for his condition, family tragedy, and anything else as well, how on earth could it have helped and have been conducive to the good working relationship you had in pursuit of perpetrators before, where you don't firstly go back to him to say, look, I'm concerned about this, I want to take it further, or failing that right to another police officer senior to him to say that you think the police should look at this again, but instead go straight to the DPP over the heads of all of them? That doesn't strike me as not wanting to unsettle him in any way.
Well, it certainly wasn't the intention. And actually, it's quite difficult to say this, but until today, I wasn't aware that DCI Settle still worked for the Metropolitan Police. I felt that he had left I understood that he'd left the police. So I'm sorry if maybe I should have called him after knowing that he was still there.
But you see, the point I'm making is to how involved you had been in this case, but in terms of not just expressing concern, passing on information, but trying to micromanage in order to achieve a result that you have set your
I do
face.
not accept that I was trying to micromanage a police inquiry. what I was trying, at all points, I've just been trying to amplify the voices of the people that have come forward. And
Yes.
Okay, but do you agree, as DCI Settle said as well, and as you know I'm concerned about, that the way this case has panned out will actually undermine the work of the police in properly pursuing potential perpetrators and undermine the preparedness of victims to come forward in the future, and that is not what you or I, I'm sure, want in the interest
we
of
certainly don't
pursuing
want
historic
that,
cases.
and I hope that isn't the outcome. Indeed, I should say that with all the publicity this week, which I saw your comments on the television on the weekend, it's led to more people coming forward to my office this week, and one of the tasks I have is to make sure that their information is passed to them.
Are they going to be handled in a different way to some of the cases?
Well, that will be down
past?
to the police, won't it?
And last question, can I just ask, have you spoken to Justice Goddard and the panel?
Not yet.
On any of these? Why not?
I'm due an appointment. I've got an appointment to see them next month.
Do you not think it should have happened sooner rather than later?
Well, there was a summer
involvement in some
there
of
was a
these
summer
cases?
recess, so but I will be seeing them.
Thank you. One very quick question, specifically related to the Brittan inquiry.
Yes, and just you said in evidence that you had made public comment in relation to the Jane allegation in blogs or articles. On the 24th of January 2015, in your article in the Mirror, you said, "I've spoken to a woman who said he raped her in 1967.
Okay.
Is that referring to the Jane allegation?
It is, yes.
And that's obviously...
and there was also a published letter that 7 MPs signed.
I'm just talking to you at the moment.
Yeah.
And so that's 3 days after Lord Brittan died. It's 2 days after the police indicated that an investigation into a rape allegation in which a man in his 70s has been questioned was ongoing. And it's before the police then decided, even though he died, whether a prosecution would have been followed. And do you not think that when you're saying at the end of your article to the Mirror on 24th of January, the police must continue their investigations, you're wanting to influence them?
I had a feeling or a belief that it may be that other allegations would not be pursued. And I think I need to leave it there when it comes to this.
Mr. Winnick has one point about them, and then Mrs. Garney.
You started off by expressing apologies over the remarks you made about Lord Brittan, and I, as a Labour colleague, are very pleased that you did so, Mr. Watson. But I want to ask you this. Do you have any regrets on taking up the campaigning issue and seeking what you believe was justice for those who were the victims of sexual abuse? And I'm not referring, of course, to one particular case.
No, I think I did the right thing with the best intentions.
Your conscience is clear.
Yes, and I think there are MPs on all sides of the House that take this matter very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Winnick. Mrs. Garney.
I think we need to put your conscience to one side, and I want to focus on the victims. I talked about the different charitable organisations that work together to provide support. They don't seem to be linked at all to your website. And you said that Jane was very, very distressed. If she was very, very distressed, what support did you provide her? What professional advice did you seek to make sure that she wasn't distressed further with you going public? I'm worried about these victims or alleged victims becoming victims twice over when you go public.
Well, with Jane, at all points, she's aware of what I've said.
What support? I mean, when I went through the NSPCC guidelines, this is not something they would do. This is not best practice when people come forward when they're victims. They would offer them different types of support, get them in touch with local authority, get them in touch with social workers, they get them in touch with local community activists so they can go to the police station with them. Professionals engaged in this all the time, providing support.
In the case of Jane, I can assure you that she does have support, and I've talked to her family to ensure that that's the case.
Thank you. We'll come to the end of this session now. Mr. Watson, reputational damage when people make allegations that are false is pretty severe, is it not?
It is.
Of the 400 people or 400 separate pieces of information, only 3 people have subsequently been convicted, all 3 with your help. Do you think that this whole process means that more people will come forward and perhaps make false allegations?
Yeah. Just to say, Mr. Vass, the 400 or the 299 in the case of my part of it, that was not 299 allegations against individual people.
Right.
It was the level of the quality of the information was varying. It was that it wasn't for me to judge what information was useful to the inquiry or not. So in those circumstances, it was the best to give it all to the police and let them come back to us to see whether we could help them with anything else.
You're now the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, you're the Chairman of the Labour Party, you're the Shadow Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office. Will you have the time to continue to do the work that you have been doing on these issues?
Well, I very much hope that we can create the public policy space to make sure that victims of serious sexual crimes feel confident that the criminal justice system will take them seriously.
And at the moment you think that's not happening still?
Well, I think we still have to build confidence. And there is another area that is unrelated directly to the Jane case, but I do think that the counselling services that victims of sexual abuse have available to them are too limited, and particularly psychiatry. And one of the things I feel responsible for doing in the future is to make sure that in the public policy space we can try and make the case, hopefully on a cross-party basis, that there needs to be much greater support for people who suffer child sexual
taking
abuse.
Mrs. Garney's point, you're not qualified to do this, and we're not qualified to do this.
No, but
somebody needs to be.
We are in a position to try and make sure the government can ensure it happens.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Mr. Watson, thank you very much for coming in today. Thank you. Order. Could we have the DPP at the... for keeping you waiting so long. I'm afraid we also had two votes which we had to attend.
That's okay, I quite understand.
In a sense, you're the easiest witness to deal with today. In terms of,
that makes a nice change.
Because I think our questions relate to your involvement, which is pretty limited, and it's really the reasons why it was so limited. Give us the explanation as to why, when the police kept writing to the CPS and saying, review what we've done, you were so, or your officials were so very firm in saying, actually, this has got nothing to do with us. This is for you to decide. Tell the committee why that was the case.
We have director's guidance which sets out what the police will do, what the CPS will do, so it's very clear, not just to each of us, but to everybody else, exactly what decisions we will make and what happens. The guidance is clear that cases that come to us for charging decisions should only do so when the police consider that it satisfies the code test, which is a realistic prospect of conviction. At no time did this meet that test. So the guidance is very clear. It's a decision that the police can make, and they make ordinarily in many cases every day of the year.
Why were they so desperate to get you to back them up in the decisions that they made? Because clearly the guidelines are very clear. As you said, the test was not met. Why do they keep writing to you, do you imagine?
Well, I think you've heard from Mr. Rodhouse why they did that. I can't put myself into their minds. All I know is that they kept asking us, and we were very clear that this did not pass the test. It was not a case that was particularly complex, so it didn't fit the guidance, and therefore it wasn't for us to make the decision. And
in respect to Mr. Watson's letter to you, you were even more clinical. He writes to you, and you just hand on the letter to the police.
Which we do in lots of cases where we get letters from other MPs or indeed members of the public which relate to investigations. It's not a matter for us. I can't answer for the police, so we always pass it straight to the relevant force for them to answer.
Now, you've taken some decisions which have obviously resulted in criticism of the CPS and indeed of yourself. And you've taken it, if I'd say, on the chin. You accept that this is part of the territory of being the Director of Public Prosecutions.
Absolutely.
Have you ever come across any circumstance where a decision taken by the CPS has been based on media criticism or public cynicism?
No.
And what do you feel about those words? Would you ever make a decision on that basis?
No, we make our decisions in accordance with the Code for Crown Prosecutors, and that's the only thing that we make our decisions on. So whether there's realistic prospect of conviction, looking at the evidence, and it's got to be reliable and admissible in court, and whether or not it's in the public interest. If the first one, realistic prospect of conviction, isn't met, we don't even go into the public interest. That doesn't have any...
So you would like to see a change in the law, as Bernard Hogan Howe suggests, that the guidance should be amended, which would allow you to be giving advice to the Metropolitan Police on what appears to be operational matters?
Well, we don't have to change the law for that because it's the director's guidance. So it's my guidance, albeit that this current guidance was signed off by my predecessor. So I could change the guidance if I thought that was appropriate. What I don't want is for us to become responsible for decisions that are rightly the police's territory. We're not investigators. We don't make operational decisions in relation to investigations. We can advise and we can help, but those decisions are not for us. So I'm very clear about that, and there is no reason in the majority of cases, in a lot of cases, the police will make those decisions.
So you don't want to change the guidance? You don't see any reason why they should be changed?
We, at the moment, and we had a meeting on it yesterday, we are talking to the police about some of these issues and whether or not they're making representations as to why they think we should change the guidance.
Can I just, before I open this up to colleagues, talk about the Paul Gambaccini case? We accept your explanation. We're not happy about your explanation, but we accept it. That for administrative reasons you didn't write to Mr. Gambaccini.
And I'm very sorry for that.
Well, thank you very much for that. Just explain the difference between the file you got in February and the one you got in September, and why did you have to wait for that file?
Well, as I said, we make our decisions in accordance with the code, and that is whether or not there is a realistic prospect of conviction, whether there's sufficient evidence. In order for us to make that decision in many cases, we do need a full file of evidence, which means that all investigative avenues have been pursued, whether they might be exculpatory or whether they might be to prove the offence. We weren't satisfied. Well, I think the first time when we had the file, we were giving what we call early investigative advice, which is not a charging decision. It's about where the investigation is, what other avenues might be pursued, what sort of things we would be looking for in a full charging file. When the file came in, we still didn't have enough, so there was a bit of to and froing to make sure that we got everything we needed in order to make a charging decision.
So if you'd got that in February, you could have made that decision earlier, and Mr. Gambaccini would have been spared 6 months of under the yew tree, as he called it.
Yes, I mean, we can't make our decisions until we get a full file of evidence, and we don't make our decisions apart from certain cases where people are in custody and there's an immediate threat.
But you've now written to him?
Yes, I have written to him.
Thank you. Is that in the public domain, that letter?
I haven't put it in the public domain. I have sent my letter directly to him.
Right. We will write to him and get a copy if he's happy with that. David Burrows.
From DCI Settle that on 19th of August 2013 he received advice from Deborah Carr, CBS, that concluded, on the evidence I've seen, I'm of the view that there is insufficient evidence to prove that the suspect would have been aware that the victim was not consenting. And then you may well have heard, I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear, his evidence that he couldn't justify a lawful use of police power in terms of cautioning before interview and moving to the point of interview. Was that a sound decision by him?
That's an operational matter for the police, and we're very clear that that's an operational matter for the police. So our advice, which was given at that stage, which was early investigative advice, made it clear that we thought there wasn't sufficient at that stage for a realistic prospect of conviction, and made it clear that any other action was a matter for the police to decide in accordance with PACE and their own regulations.
But from what you've heard, you seem to that was relied upon in terms of getting not to get to the first hurdle. He didn't get the first hurdle even to interview. Is that unusual for an officer to get to that point in these type of allegations, to the point where they don't actually decide to interview?
I mean, it's difficult to say because it's almost the negative, because those type of cases will never come to us. So I should imagine that there are, for the number of reports that go to the police and the number of cases that come to us, There may well be other cases, but I would have no idea as to the number because they would by definition tend not to come to us.
But the relevance of this, with the letter from Mr Watson, 28th of April to you, he made specific reference to the lack of interview and indeed arrest as well, and also to the guidance, which is the CPS and ACPO guidance. Is there anything in that guidance that supports the case that at that stage he should have been interviewed?
I mean, there will always be some cases where the allegation is such right at the beginning that an officer would be able to make a judgment that it's not going to pass, it's not going to get any further, and therefore there is no point in actually going ahead and interviewing anyone. In this particular case, we gave very clear early investigative advice that from the complainant's account herself, we didn't think there was enough on that alone for it to go ahead, and there would not be sufficient evidence for a realistic prospect.
I struggled in this guidance to find anything that would suggest that there was anything that's done contrary at the moment to the officer's decision not to process it into an interview. There's nothing.
I think it's a matter of judgment. I think so. I don't think there is anything that's contrary to it.
And then,
Stick your finger. Sorry, please continue.
so, and you'll have heard, obviously, looking now on this, what we've heard over the evidence from a number of people, that plainly there's wide difference of opinion in relation to this, ranging from the officer, DCI Settle, talking about the issue that it was be grossly disproportionate, lacking legal basis to take it further, referred to a baseless witch hunt. That's a serious view put forward. And then you heard the Assistant Commissioner saying he has a different view on it. When you're looking at this and you have guidance that's looking at these serious allegations, do you have any comments?
I mean, I can't comment on their sort of disagreement. What I can say is that we, at the early investigative advice stage, we said that we thought that on the basis of the information we had, which was the complainant's evidence and some other bits, we did not think there was a realistic prospect of conviction. It did not get any stronger with any further investigation, and that's why we were clear it never met the test for coming to us for charging advice, because there was never a realistic prospect of conviction.
Finally, just were you aware of any contact from Mr Watson with your office or any other officers in relation to the Metropolitan Police and those involved in these investigations subsequent to the 28th of April concerning the allegation of Jay?
No, the only contact I was aware of was the letter from Mr Watson to me. That was the only contact. I wasn't aware of anything else.
Thank you. David Winnick.
Just one or two matters to clarify issues, Ms Saunders. Do you know Tom Watson in a social sense?
No.
In other words, is he a friend of yours, to put it in blunt
No,
terms?
I met him today for the first time as we were sitting here. So that's the first time I've met him.
The first time? Some have said that it's surprising, but in his letter, the 28th of April, he begins, "Dear Alison." Now, I know there's something perhaps strange to my generation in trying to abolish surnames, which I'm not too sympathetic about, but is it surprising that he should address you by your first name?
I should say I'm addressed by many things by many different people, but I'm never surprised at what people address me as.
You can rest assured, should I ever write to you, it won't be "Dear Alison." But your reply is "Dear Mr Watson."
Yes.
What I want to make it absolute, what I want to ask you is that, and perhaps you can make it absolutely clear, was there any intervention, be it by this letter from Mr Watson or any other source, that influenced your decision in a particular case?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. I should declare my interest. I do write to the DPP and say "Dear Alison" in my letters.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
She has very kindly replied, "Dear Mr Vaz." Nusrat Ghani.
Oh, thank you. The contradictory evidence this morning from Mr Settle and the Met Police. And I just want to understand if there are processes in place, whether everybody is aware of them or whether there is some ignorance being played out here.
The processes are very clearly set out in around what should come to us for charging advice, what should come to us for early investigative advice.
Everyone that gave evidence this morning should have been made aware, apart from Mr Watson, should have been made aware of all.
It's very clearly set out, whether people are aware or not. We always have very good policy. Sometimes people are not aware of them, but it's very clear from the director's guidance, which everyone should know, when cases come to us for charging and when they don't.
I'm just concerned that there might have been, within the Met, there might be some institutional blindness, for example, that they've chosen to ignore procedures and just make decisions based on their own judgment.
We certainly made it clear right from the beginning where we thought the line was in this particular case, and we maintained that line.
So you made it clear, but they didn't understand that at all?
Well, they obviously kept asking us to review that, so...
My other concern is that the repercussions of this case to victims who might be deterred from coming forward, that they might feel that they may not be taken seriously, or they need to have a person of power, a man of establishment like Mr Watson. He would be the only person to deliver them justice. Can you comment on that at all?
I would sincerely hope it does not put anybody off coming forward. If they've been the subject of an offence, an alleged offence, one would hope they would come forward and report that to the police and go through the procedures where they can have support and they can make their allegations, and those allegations can be investigated. And I would certainly encourage anyone to come forward.
And has Mr Watson's involvement damaged the cause of abuse victims coming forward and seeking justice?
I would sincerely hope not.
Not? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart MacDonald and then James Berry.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, do you ever have cases where reasonable, competent lawyers come to different decisions on whether or not to prosecute a case?
Yes.
Quite regularly?
Sorry?
How do you resolve these? Does it happen often?
It doesn't happen often, no. We do have them.
Yeah.
And it's a case of sitting down and debating, and at some point somebody makes a decision, normally the more senior person.
Okay. And as regards the early investigative advice that was given, that was in no way designed to influence the decision whether or not to interview Lord Brittan?
No, and we made it very clear in the advice. It makes it very clear. It says it's an operational matter for the police.
And finally, I mean, this could be the subject of a whole separate inquiry. Interviews of somebody who's been accused of rape could be a fairly significant part of a prosecution from time to time.
No, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. James Berry.
Yes, well, I think what the Met Police want is for your guidance to be, or the guidance in your name, to be changed so that they can refer cases to you where the evidence is on the margin, basically, of the threshold, and also cases where the evidence does not meet the threshold, but the public interest test is met, in their view, nonetheless. And you, I think, disagree with the need for a change.
Well, I think there is a role for the police, which they make decisions in these cases now and do so regularly across the country. So there's no reason for that to be changed. From my own perspective, I think it's important that we, the CPS, deal with those cases that we really should do, and within our existing resources, we're very conscious about what we should be doing. So to open the floodgates and the doors to have more cases coming in where there is no realistic prospect of conviction. So it doesn't matter whether or not the public interest is in pursuing the case. If you don't have the evidence, you can't go ahead with it.
You don't get to stage 2, yeah. And it's right, isn't it, that in our system there are at least 3 levels. We've got the police, and then the CPS, and then the judge if he has to decide whether to put the case to the jury. And it's important that at every stage a decision is taken without fear or favour and independently.
Absolutely.
But there is, of course, an opportunity to pass the buck at every stage, and you wouldn't want to see that happen. You want to see each of those individual actors taking that decision without passing the buck.
Absolutely, and constitutionally that's what should happen.
Precisely.
And for public confidence, I think it's important as well that
I've got to say, it's not something you're criticised for, because I see that you shouldn't have put a case forward to trial because the trial collapsed, or you should have put the case forward to trial and you didn't. But so it's not a criticism that you normally get. But anyway, finally, as a senior lawyer, would you agree that it is unhelpful to a court or an inquiry for the allegations that tribunal will be considering to be bandied about in tabloid newspapers prior to the hearing?
Absolutely. If a case is going to court, the court should be the place where the evidence is tested and where it is heard and where an independent tribunal can decide on it.
And you would not expect a Member of Parliament, no less, to put those kind of allegations into a newspaper?
If a case is going to court, it should be heard in court. It doesn't matter who the individuals are. It should be heard in court and tested in court, and the tribunal can then make their decision.
And that includes a public inquiry? Thank you.
Victoria Hopkins.
And just following on from that, Director, and I should declare I have been instructed by the Crown Prosecution Service over the years, the point about achieving best evidence that I mentioned with Mr Watson, this is a 300-page manual that provides guidance to investigators, social workers, all sorts of parties within the criminal justice system to do exactly as it says, achieve best evidence for victims or complainants of sexual offences. And when people, no matter how well-meaning, when people veer away from that guidance, what sort of repercussions can there be further on down the line?
Well, if we don't have evidence that's obtained through the proper channels, then it may be that the evidence of the witness who's given, if they're giving evidence in court, there's inconsistent statements, or there may be some allegation that, as you said earlier, that they've been coached. And there is an art, particularly in serious sexual cases or involving vulnerable witnesses, to obtaining the best evidence. It can take a long time. It takes training. There's lots of quite rightly safeguards there for the individual as well as for the defendant as well.
And I know this is a word that will send a shiver down your spine, but DCI Settle mentioned the word disclosure. And for anyone who's not familiar with the workings of the legal world, there are all sorts of separate legal issues with disclosure of what's called unused material. In other words, material that may be relevant to the investigation but doesn't form part of the trial.
Yes.
And again, this is where as allegations may form part of that disclosure exercise.
Well, anything that undermines the prosecution case or assists the defence, we have a duty to disclose and would do so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. Director, thank you very much for coming in. You've been extremely clear in what you've said. We're extremely grateful, and I apologise again for keeping you waiting for so long. Most grateful.
Thank you.
Order. That concludes the inquiry session for today.
Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room. 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 Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room.
Line E 4x3, line L 16x9. Line E 4x3, line L